beyond repair. Gavin Sloan set the $200,000 estimate on the table and straightened his jacket, the kind of man who delivered financial death sentences the way other people ordered coffee. Behind him, the armored Range Rover sat cold in Fenwick Sovereign Motors' service bay, door locks, frozen, brakes, unresponsive. 32 separate error codes burning across every screen on the dashboard. 2 full days of diagnostics. One conclusion: $200,000 to replace the wiring harness, 3 control modules, and the entire security lock system. Malcolm Raines, the black single father, Fenwick had fired 3 years earlier, crouched behind the driver's seat, traced one grounding wire seated against a painted surface, and replaced it with a part that cost $15. Every warning light cleared. Every system came back online. Someone had turned a $15 fix into a $200,000 verdict. This is that story. If you've ever been told something was beyond saving and felt something wasn't right about that, stick around. Subscribe if you haven't already. This one's worth hearing to the end. Raines' diagnostic works didn't look like much from the street. The sign above the roll-up door had lost one of its mounting bolts sometime the previous winter and now hung at a slight angle that Malcolm had never gotten around to fixing. The building itself was a converted warehouse unit near Shockoe bottom brick walls, a concrete floor stained with decades of oil and coolant. 2 hydraulic lifts that groaned on cold mornings before warming up, and a small waiting area in the corner with 3 mismatched chairs and a coffee maker that ran on borrowed time. There was nothing about the place that suggested sophistication, and Malcolm had long stopped pretending otherwise. What the garage had was tools, a diagnostic machine he was still paying off in monthly installments, and a man who knew how to use both without guessing. Malcolm had spent 11 years at Fenwick Sovereign Motors, the kind of dealership where the waiting room had leather chairs and fresh-cut flowers, and the service advisors wore pressed shirts with embroidered logos. Fenwick didn't service ordinary cars. It handled armored vehicles, executive transports, and customized security platforms for politicians, corporate executives, and private protection firms. The kind of clientele who expected problems to be solved without delay and invoiced without hesitation. Malcolm had been the best diagnostic technician the service floor had ever seen. Not the loudest, not the most senior, but the one the others brought their unsolvable problems to because Malcolm didn't work by guessing. He read the data, traced the logic, and found the one thread that explained everything else. It was the kind of ability that made him valuable and eventually inconvenient. The trouble started with invoices. Not all of them, most of the work at Fenwick was legitimate, necessary, and priced accordingly. But over time, Malcolm noticed a pattern in a certain category of repairs, customers being billed for control modules and wiring assemblies when the root cause had never actually been confirmed. He raised it through the right channels, first the way you were supposed to. He wrote up his concerns in service reports, flagged specific cases, and requested that diagnostic procedures be reviewed before expensive parts were ordered. The responses were polite and brief and led nowhere. When he refused to sign off on a repair estimate he didn't believe was supported by the data, the conversation changed. 3 weeks later, his access badge stopped working. His HR file listed the reason as failure to comply with internal procedures. The real reason was simpler: he had started asking questions that the service department's profit margins couldn't afford to answer. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Malcolm had built something small and entirely his own. The garage didn't bring in the kind of money Fenwick generated in a single afternoon, but every invoice Malcolm sent reflected work he had actually done and parts that had actually needed replacing. He slept fine. What kept him awake most nights had nothing to do with the business. It was the bank statements, the installment schedule on the diagnostic machine, and the calendar reminder for Nyla's school tuition that appeared every month like a quiet accusation. Nyla was 11, sharp-eyed, and self-sufficient in the way children become when they understand without being told directly that things are tight. Her mother had died of a stroke 3 years earlier, the same year Malcolm lost his job, and the combination of those two events had rearranged the entire architecture of his life. He was her father and her mother and her sole financial reality. And he carried all of it without complaint because complaint wouldn't fix anything. The only other person in the garage was Theo Maddox, 23 years old, and 2 semesters short of a trade school certificate he'd had to abandon when the tuition money ran out. Theo was good with his hands, fast to learn, and honest about what he didn't know, which on the electrical and systems side of things was still quite a lot. Malcolm paid him a wage that wasn't generous, and supplemented it with training that most technicians would have charged for. It was a functional arrangement, the kind built on necessity and mutual respect, rather than paperwork. The rain had been falling since before dawn on the morning the flatbed arrived. Malcolm heard the truck before he saw it. The air brake released the hydraulic whine of the loading ramp, lowering onto the wet asphalt. He stepped out from under the lift to look, and what came off that ramp stopped him where he stood. The vehicle was a Range Rover, but calling it that, the way you'd call any other Range Rover, felt inaccurate. The body sat lower than stock, reinforced at the roofline and door frames. The glass was thick enough to distort the reflection of the streetlights. The undercarriage had additional plating that wasn't factory. Malcolm had seen vehicles like this before many times at Fenwick, and he knew exactly which dealership's service history would be attached to it. The woman who stepped out of the black sedan that had followed the flatbed was Helena Whitmore. Malcolm didn't know her by sight, but Theo had looked her up the moment the appointment was booked, founder of Whitmore Executive Protection, a firm that provided secure transport and close protection for international business executives. The company's reputation was its product, and its product depended entirely on the reliability of its vehicles. The Range Rover sitting on his flatbed was her flagship unit, worth somewhere north of $500,000, and it was completely dead. Helena didn't waste time on pleasantries. She explained what had happened with the efficiency of someone accustomed to briefings. The vehicle had gone into Fenwick Sovereign Motors 3 days earlier for routine maintenance and a software update. Hours after leaving the dealership, the warning lights had begun appearing. First the brake system, then the door locks, then the cameras, then the emergency communication module. By the time the vehicle stalled in the middle of an intersection while transporting a client to the airport, the dashboard was displaying 32 simultaneous fault codes across systems that had no business failing at the same time. Fenwick had held the vehicle for 2 days before Gavin Sloan delivered his conclusion: moisture infiltration in the central wiring harness, multiple control modules compromised beyond reliable function, and a repair estimate of $200,000 that would take a minimum of 10 weeks to complete. Malcolm listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her he couldn't take the vehicle. He explained it carefully. The Range Rover was still under Fenwick's service warranty, and the moment he touched any component, Gavin Sloan would have the legal standing to claim unauthorized interference with a specialized security platform. The liability exposure wasn't theoretical. And beyond the legal question, Malcolm knew Gavin personally. Gavin was the man who had signed his termination. Taking this job wouldn't just be risky, it would hand his former employer exactly the kind of grievance they needed to finish what they'd started 3 years ago. Helena reached into the folder she was carrying and placed 2 documents on the workbench between them. The first was the Fenwick estimate, $200,000 itemized across wiring harnesses, control modules, security lock assemblies, and armor recertification fees. The second was the vehicle's operational log showing every system test result from the 48 hours before the car went in for service. Every reading was normal. Every system had been certified functional. The vehicle had entered Fenwick's service bay in perfect working order and left it as a $200,000 problem. Helena didn't ask Malcolm to fix the car. She asked him one question: how does a vehicle with a clean bill of health develop 32 simultaneous system failures hours after a routine maintenance visit? Malcolm looked at the 2 documents for a long moment. Then he looked across the waiting area where Nyla had fallen asleep in one of the mismatched chairs, with her homework folder open on her lap, a pencil still tucked between her fingers. She did that sometimes when she stayed late, fought sleep until she lost always in the middle of something, as if stopping on purpose felt like giving up. Malcolm had covered her with a shop jacket without waking her, and she hadn't moved since. He knew what he stood to lose if this went wrong. The garage, the machine he was still paying off Theo's wage, the thin margin between where they were and the bank's patience. He also knew that the question Helena had just asked him was the same question he had been asking 3 years ago in a different building about different vehicles, and that the reason he no longer worked there was precisely because he hadn't been willing to stop asking it. Malcolm turned back to Helena and set 2 conditions before she could say anything else. Every step of the inspection would be recorded on video with timestamps. And if Fenwick made any move against the garage in response, Helena would allow him to release the diagnostic data publicly. She agreed to both without hesitation. Malcolm added a 3rd condition of his own. He would not replace a single component until he had identified the root cause with data he could reproduce. Not a module, not a wire, not a sensor. Nothing got swapped out on a theory. Helena signed the inspection authorization. Malcolm printed it, countersigned, and handed Theo the first of the 2 cameras they would be running throughout the process. Theo mounted the first unit on a magnetic bracket above the driver's side lift point. Malcolm positioned the second one at eye level with the undercarriage access panel angled to capture both his hands and the components behind the driver's seat bulkhead, the area he already suspected that Fenwick's technicians had accessed during the maintenance visit. Outside, the rain was still coming down. Inside, Malcolm pulled on his gloves, picked up his diagnostic interface, and plugged into the vehicle's OBD port. The screen filled with fault codes almost immediately, 32 of them spread across brake control door lock actuation camera, power emergency communications engine protection mode, and perimeter alarm. Any technician following standard procedure would have looked at that list and started working through it system by system, ordering parts as each one failed its individual test. That was the procedure. That was also how you ended up with a $200,000 estimate for a problem that might have a single point of origin. Malcolm didn't start with the systems. He started with the timestamp on the fault log, the precise moment down to the fraction of a second when the first code appeared. Then he checked the second code, then the third. Every single fault in the log had generated within the same fraction of a second. Not sequentially, not over the course of minutes or hours as individual components degraded. All at once, as if someone had thrown a switch. 32 independent systems do not fail simultaneously. They fail simultaneously only when they lose something they all share: a common voltage reference, a common ground, a common point of electrical stability that, when disrupted, causes every module drawing from it to register an anomaly and begin shutting itself down in sequence. Malcolm straightened up and told Theo to get the voltage meter and the thermal camera. They weren't going to start with the modules. They were going to start with the ground. The inspection had begun. Behind Malcolm, Nyla slept in the mismatched chair, her homework folder rising and falling with her breathing. Outside, Fenwick Sovereign Motors was 3 miles away and completely unaware that the man they had fired 3 years ago had just agreed to answer a question they had decided wasn't worth asking. The voltage meter found nothing wrong at first. That was the problem, and Malcolm suspected the reason Fenwick had been so confident in their conclusion. When the Range Rover sat at rest with only its base systems drawing current, every reading came back within acceptable range. The battery was fully charged, the alternator output was stable, and there was no visible evidence of moisture anywhere along the main wiring harness. If Malcolm had stopped there, he would have had no grounds to dispute the $200,000 estimate. But he didn't stop there because the fault log had already told him something the parts list couldn't explain. He asked Theo to activate the climate control, the exterior lighting, the communication array, and the door lock system simultaneously, everything that would have been running when the vehicle was carrying a passenger in transit. Theo reached across the center console and brought each system online one by one. The cabin filled with the low hum of the blower motor, the soft click of the lock actuators cycling, the blue glow of the communication screen initializing. Malcolm watched the voltage meter. For 3 seconds, everything held. Then the reading between the vehicle chassis and the body frame began to drift, not dramatically, not in a way that would have triggered an immediate alarm, but enough. A variance of less than a volt fluctuating in rhythm with the electrical load cycling up and down in a pattern that made no sense if the grounding circuit was intact. Malcolm told Theo to hold the systems on and not touch anything. He got down on his back and worked himself underneath the driver's side bulkhead, with a flashlight moving past the armor plating that lined the lower door frame and into the space behind the forward seat mount. The area was cramped and dark and smelled of the anti-corrosion compound that had been applied during the vehicle's original upfit. Behind a steel bracket that had clearly been removed and reinstalled, the torque marks on the bolts were slightly off-center, the kind of detail left by someone reassembling under time pressure. Malcolm found the main chassis ground cable, a thick copper braid, the kind rated to carry the combined electrical load of every system on the vehicle. It looked intact from a distance. Up close with the flashlight aimed at the mounting point, he could see exactly what had happened. The terminal had been seated against the factory paint layer instead of bare metal. Not cut, not corroded, not flooded, just bolted down in the wrong position with a thin layer of anti-rust coating sitting between the copper contact and the metal it was supposed to bond with. When the vehicle sat idle, the load was low enough that current could still find a path through. But the moment multiple high-draw systems came online at the same time, the resistance at that single point increased just enough to destabilize the voltage reference for every module drawing from the same ground network. Each module detected an anomaly, flagged it as a fault, and began executing its shutdown protocol to prevent damage. 32 systems going offline in the same fraction of a second wasn't a catastrophic failure. It was 32 computers doing exactly what they were programmed to do when their shared foundation became unreliable. The fix was a new copper ground cable properly terminated, seated on bare metal and torqued to specification. The part cost $15. Malcolm spent the next 90 minutes documenting everything before he touched it voltage readings at 6 different load levels, thermal imaging of the contact point, a written log of every fault code alongside the precise electrical conditions that triggered it. He wasn't building a repair record, he was building a case. When he finally installed the new cable, cleaned the contact surface down to bare metal, seated the terminal flush, and applied a thin layer of dielectric compound over the joint to prevent future oxidation. He did it with both cameras running and Helena Whitmore standing 4 feet away, watching every movement. Malcolm reconnected the battery, straightened up, and nodded at Theo. Theo started the engine. The fault codes began clearing one cluster at a time. The brake control system came back online. The door locks cycled and held. The cameras initialized across all 6 exterior positions. The emergency communication module completed its startup sequence and showed a full signal. The engine protection mode deactivated, and the vehicle returned to normal operating status without a single warning light remaining on the dashboard. All 32 codes gone. Helena looked at the screen for a long moment, then looked at Malcolm. She didn't say anything immediately, and she didn't need to. Malcolm took the Range Rover out for a 2-hour road test in the rain, running every high-load combination he could generate: full climate control, all exterior lighting, active communication systems, door cycling at speed, emergency brake simulation. The voltage held flat across every test. The ground was stable. The vehicle was fine. The following morning, Helena forwarded Malcolm's full diagnostic report to Fenwick Sovereign Motors. By midday, Gavin Sloan had sent a response that was 3 paragraphs long and said in precise legal language almost nothing except that Malcolm had likely masked the symptoms of deeper module damage by clearing the fault codes, that the previous voltage instability may have caused permanent harm to the security controllers, and that Fenwick would not accept liability for any future failure of a vehicle that had been handled by an uncertified independent facility. 2 hours after that, Fenwick's legal team sent a formal notice to Helena's office. The vehicle's warranty coverage was under review. The armor certification status was in question, and Fenwick reserved the right to notify Helena's insurers about unauthorized third-party intervention in a specialized security platform. Gavin also contacted two of Whitmore Executive Protection's active clients, directly informing them that the armored vehicle assigned to their protection details had been serviced by a garage without manufacturer authorization. Both clients placed their contracts on hold the same afternoon. Malcolm heard about the Fenwick response through Helena's assistant, who called the garage just before 3 o'clock. He was standing at the lift with a socket wrench in his hand, and he set it down carefully on the tool tray and didn't pick it back up for the rest of the day. He had known something like this was coming. Knowing it didn't make it easier to absorb. What Gavin Sloan understood, what he had always understood, was that the technical argument was only one dimension of the problem. Malcolm could prove the car was running. He could document the fault to fix the test results. But proof of competence wasn't the same as proof of authority. And in the world Fenwick operated in, authority was everything. A $200,000 estimate carried institutional weight. A $15 repair from a garage in a converted warehouse carried the burden of justifying itself to everyone who hadn't been there to watch it happen. The next morning, a state inspector appeared at Rains Diagnostic Works before 8 o'clock, carrying a clipboard and an anonymous complaint that had been filed the previous evening. The complaint alleged that Malcolm had performed unauthorized service on an armored security vehicle, used diagnostic software outside its licensed scope, and deliberately cleared fault codes to conceal unresolved damage from the vehicle's owner. The inspector was professionally neutral and explained that while the complaint was being reviewed, the garage's authorization to service high-value specialty vehicles would be temporarily suspended. The company that leased Malcolm his diagnostic equipment called 2 hours later and froze the account pending the outcome of the investigation. By noon, 3 customers had called to cancel appointments. By 4 o'clock, the bank had sent an automated notice, one more missed installment, and the garage would enter default proceedings. Theo found out about the diagnostic equipment freeze when the system threw an authorization error in the middle of a routine scan. He pulled Malcolm aside and asked quietly what was actually happening. Malcolm told him the short version. Theo listened without interrupting, then asked whether there was anything he could do. Malcolm told him to go home for the day. Theo said he'd rather stay. Malcolm didn't argue. That evening, Nyla heard Malcolm's half of a phone conversation with the bank that lasted 11 minutes and ended with him setting the phone face down on the workbench and standing with both hands flat on the surface, looking at nothing. She went to the back room without saying anything and came back with the small metal box she kept on her bookshelf, the one she used to hold the money she'd been putting aside for her class trip at the end of the semester. She set it on the workbench next to Malcolm's phone and went back to her homework without a word. Malcolm looked at the box for a long time. He didn't open it. He slid it back across the bench toward her side and said her name softly, and she looked up and he shook his head once. She put the box back in her bag and kept working. Neither of them said anything else about it. Helena came to the garage the following morning with a deadline. Her board had given Malcolm 48 hours to produce third-party verification from the manufacturer, confirming that the repair was technically valid and that the vehicle's safety systems remained uncompromised. Without that documentation, they would require her to return the Range Rover to Fenwick, authorize the original repair estimate, and issue a public statement acknowledging that Rains Diagnostic Works had operated outside its certified scope. Malcolm called the manufacturer's technical support line and was told politely that independent shops without active dealer network credentials were not eligible for engineering consultations on specialty platforms. Theo spent 6 hours searching technical forums and found 3 documented cases of similar ground faults in the same vehicle generation, useful background, but nothing that would hold up against Fenwick's official paperwork in a formal dispute. It was late, and Malcolm was going through old files on the hard drive of a laptop he kept in a storage cabinet near the back wall, not because he had a clear plan, but because the question Helena had asked him on the first night kept returning. He opened the archive folder and started working backward through dated files. The laptop was old, and the search function ran slowly, and twice the system locked up and had to be restarted. It took him nearly an hour to find what he was looking for. a service report he had written during his final months at Fenwick, flagging a pattern of voltage instability in armored vehicles after undercarriage protection panels were removed for service access. The report recommended that ground cable termination points be inspected and recertified whenever those panels came off because the reinstallation process consistently disturbed the contact surfaces. He had sent it through the internal system and received a one-line response from the service director. The response was from Gavin Sloan. No procedure change required. Continue processing under controller fault protocol. Malcolm read the line twice and then sat back in his chair. He had written that report in good faith through proper channels with documentation. Gavin had read it, understood it, and buried it in a single sentence, because changing the procedure would have meant fewer controller replacements, and fewer controller replacements would have meant lower service revenue, and lower service revenue would have meant Gavin failing to meet the targets that had been handed down to him from above. Malcolm had known for years that Fenwick's billing patterns were problematic, but sitting in that chair at that hour looking at that one-line response, he understood for the first time that Gavin hadn't started out as a dishonest man. He had started out as a technician who chose at some point to stop asking questions and had spent the years since building a system that punished anyone who asked them instead. He pulled up the Fenwick estimate again and read through the itemized list: wiring harness replacement, 3 control modules, security lock assembly armor, recertification. Each line was specific, technical, and completely disconnected from any diagnostic data that would have justified it. The estimate wasn't the conclusion of an investigation. It was the starting point of a transaction. He was still reading when Helena called to tell him that her board had made their decision. The Range Rover was being collected from Rains Diagnostic Works in the morning. Malcolm had until then to decide whether to sign Fenwick's settlement agreement, the one that required him to retract his diagnostic report, acknowledge the repair as insufficient, and agree not to service any vehicle previously handled by Fenwick's network. In exchange, the complaint against his license would be dropped and his equipment lease would be unfrozen. Malcolm had the agreement open on screen in front of him, the cursor sitting on the digital signature field, when he heard Nyla's voice from the doorway behind him. "If they could use your name to lie once," she said, "how do you know they haven't done it to someone else?" Malcolm moved the cursor away from the signature field and closed the window. Nyla had already gone back to her homework by the time Malcolm closed the settlement window. He didn't close it by signing it. He closed it by shutting the laptop. The question she had asked was not a complicated one, but it had landed in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, the way simple questions sometimes do when everything else has become too tangled to think through clearly. If Fenwick had used his credentials to create a document he hadn't signed, they hadn't done it for this case specifically. A forged electronic signature requires access to a system, a process, and a precedent. It required someone to have decided at some earlier point that the risk was acceptable, which meant it had been done before, which meant there was a record of it somewhere, which meant the document Gavin had produced in that meeting was not a one-time improvisation. It was a method. Malcolm pulled the repair order Gavin had presented and looked at the timestamp again. 9:42 in the morning. He opened the folder on his laptop where he kept his old employment records and found the certificate of completion from the manufacturer's training program in Norfolk, dated, signed, and stamped with the program coordinator's name. The training had run from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon. Norfolk was more than 90 miles from Richmond. There was no version of that day in which Malcolm Rains had been standing in Fenwick's service bay at 9:42, reviewing a vehicle and authorizing a $20,000 controller replacement. The signature was his name. The action was impossible. He called Theo that night and asked him to do one thing before he came in, the next morning pull every record he could find showing when Malcolm's employee credentials had last been used in Fenwick's system. Theo called back before midnight. The technician code assigned to Malcolm during his employment had been active in the system for 4 months after his termination date, logging inspections, signing off on estimates, generating authorization records for work Malcolm had never seen on vehicles he had never touched. Malcolm brought this to Helena the following morning, 40 minutes before the board's deadline expired. He told her he wasn't signing the settlement. He told her why. Helena listened to all of it, then made 2 calls. The first was to her board buying time by invoking her authority as founder and accepting personal liability for the decision. The second was to Elliot Graves. Elliot was a data forensics consultant who had worked insurance fraud cases for 15 years before going independent. He was methodical, unhurried, and entirely unimpressed by institutional authority, the kind of person who treated a corporate server archive the way Malcolm treated a fault log, following the data wherever it led without concern for what it might cost the people who had built the system. Helena explained the situation in broad terms and asked him to examine Fenwick's backup server records for evidence of credential misuse and record alteration. Elliot said he would need access a signed authorization from Helena as the vehicle owner, and however long it took. He did not promise a specific outcome. The next 36 hours were the quietest and most expensive of the entire ordeal. The garage sat idle. The diagnostic equipment remained frozen. Theo came in anyway and spent the time reorganizing the tool storage and repainting the lift markings on the floor because he said it needed doing, and he didn't know what else to do with himself. Nyla finished her homework early each evening and sat in the waiting area reading close enough that Malcolm could see her from the workbench. Nobody said much. The bank deadline was still running in the background, and Malcolm had stopped checking his phone every hour because the information it contained wasn't going to change between checks. Elliot called Helena on the morning of the second day. He had found enough. The backup server contained a version history for every service record Fenwick had generated over the previous 4 years. Most records had a single version created when the technician completed the work unchanged after that. But a subset of records had been modified after the fact, some of them multiple times with the editing credentials belonging to a supervisor-level account. The original versions of those records contained language like ground inspection required, controller fault, unconfirmed, and further evaluation needed before parts authorization. The modified versions replaced those notes with approved replacement orders, cost summaries, and technician sign-offs that had not appeared in the originals. The edits were systematic and concentrated in a specific category of repairs, high-value component replacements on specialty vehicles. The most significant finding was in the Range Rover's own file. An internal purchase order for 3 control modules and a central wiring harness totaling just under $200,000 had been submitted and approved 2 days before Helena's vehicle arrived at Fenwick for its service appointment. The parts had been ordered before the car was diagnosed. The conclusion had been written before the question was asked. Elliot also found the manufacturer's technical bulletin that Fenwick had received 8 months earlier, a document specifically addressing ground cable termination integrity after undercarriage panel removal on armored vehicle platforms. The bulletin had been logged into the system by an administrative account and immediately reclassified as non-applicable by the same supervisor-level credentials responsible for the record edits. The technicians on the service floor had never seen it. Helena arranged the independent inspection through her insurance carrier's testing facility. She notified Fenwick through her legal team that the inspection would occur and that their representative was welcome to attend. Gavin Sloan arrived with 2 attorneys. Claudia Fenwick, whose name was on the sign above the dealership door, came separately and sat on the opposite side of the room from Gavin without acknowledging him. The testing facility was a large climate-controlled bay with calibrated instrumentation and a lift rated for armored vehicle weights. Representatives from the state regulatory office were present along with the insurance carrier's senior technical analyst and an engineering consultant from the vehicle manufacturer who had flown in from the regional office the previous afternoon. Malcolm and Theo stood on one side of the vehicle. Gavin and his attorneys stood on the other. Claudia Fenwick sat in a chair near the wall and watched. Malcolm walked through the diagnosis the same way he had explained it to Theo on the first night, not with technical jargon, but with logic. 32 systems do not fail at the same moment unless they share a common failure point. A common failure point in a vehicle's electrical architecture is almost always a power source or a ground reference. The power source was intact. The ground was not. The ground was not intact because the contact surface had been compromised during a maintenance procedure that involved removing the protective panel behind the driver's seat bulkhead, a procedure Fenwick had performed 3 days before the faults appeared. The manufacturer's own technical bulletin, issued 8 months earlier, had specified the inspection requirement for exactly this procedure. That bulletin had not been distributed to Fenwick's technicians. The manufacturer's engineering consultant examined the ground cable installation, and the contact surface reviewed Malcolm's documented measurements and confirmed each point in turn. The cable was a standard serviceable component. Replacing it did not affect the vehicle's armor certification. There was no evidence of moisture infiltration in the wiring harness. None of the control modules showed signatures of voltage damage. Malcolm's diagnostic process was consistent with manufacturer-recommended methodology. The $200,000 estimate had no technical basis in the data. The Range Rover was then run through a full high-load test sequence, climate control, exterior lighting, communication systems, door actuators, emergency brake simulation, perimeter alarm, cycling all simultaneously sustained for 40 minutes. Every system held. Not a single fault code appeared. When the vehicle test concluded, Elliott presented the server data. He walked through the version history of the modified records, the timeline of the purchase order that predated Helena's service appointment, and the reclassification of the manufacturer bulletin. He used no dramatic language. He simply showed the sequence of events in the order they had occurred and let the timestamps speak. Claudia Fenwick asked one question. She directed it at Gavin, not at her attorneys, and she asked it in the tone of someone who had already done the math and was giving him the chance to say it himself. She asked why nearly $200,000 in parts had been ordered and approved before the vehicle had been brought in for diagnosis. Gavin said he had been preparing in advance to reduce turnaround time for a priority client. Claudia asked him to explain how he had known which parts to order before the diagnostic had been completed. Gavin's attorneys leaned in and spoke to him quietly. Gavin didn't answer the question. He sat with his hands on the table and said nothing. Not the silence of someone innocent and stunned, but the silence of someone who had run out of road and knew it. Claudia stood up, spoke briefly to her own legal counsel, and then addressed the room. She announced that Gavin Sloan was suspended effective immediately, that his system access had been revoked as of that morning, and that the complete record set Elliott had compiled was being transferred to the state regulatory authority and the manufacturer's compliance office for formal review. She said it without visible emotion, the way someone delivers a decision they made before they walked into the room. The complaint against Malcolm's license was withdrawn by end of business that day. His equipment lease was unfrozen the following morning. Fenwick issued a written acknowledgement to Helena's insurance carrier, confirming that the Range Rover did not require wiring harness replacement or control module installation, that the vehicle's armor certification remained valid, and that Fenwick accepted financial responsibility for the contracts Helena had lost during the period the vehicle was out of service. A subsequent review of the service records identified 38 cases over the previous 3 years in which customers had been billed for controller replacements on vehicles, where the original diagnostic notes had indicated ground faults, loose connections, or unresolved power supply anomalies as the more likely cause. Fenwick's legal team began the process of contacting each of those customers. Helena came to the garage 2 days after the inspection. She made an offer a 3-year exclusive maintenance contract for the full Whitmore Executive Protection Fleet, structured as an independent service agreement that would not require Malcolm to close Rain's diagnostic works or take on a title or a schedule that didn't belong to him. The contract value was enough to clear the overdue bank installments, buy out the diagnostic equipment lease, cover Theo's salary with room to grow, and fund the electronics testing area Malcolm had been planning in his head for 2 years without the money to act on it. Malcolm signed it the same afternoon. Claudia Fenwick came to the garage a week later alone without attorneys. She apologized for the termination, acknowledged that the complaint filing had been retaliatory, and offered to reinstate Malcolm's position at Fenwick with back compensation for the 3 years he had been gone. Malcolm thanked her and declined. He told her he didn't want the desk back. What he wanted was for Fenwick to build a system where a technician could raise a concern without it becoming a career-ending event. Claudia asked him what that looked like in practice. Malcolm told her any repair estimate above $5,000 required a second technician to independently verify the diagnostic finding before parts were ordered. No manager at any level was permitted to edit a technician's written diagnostic notes after the fact. And any technician who needed to report a concern about a repair authorization had a direct path to the internal audit function that did not pass through the service director's office. Claudia said she would implement all three. The Range Rover came back to Rain's Diagnostic Works 6 weeks later for its first scheduled service under the new contract. Theo handled the intake while Malcolm finished a brake inspection on the lift. Nyla was at the front desk, a real desk now, not the folding table that had served that function for the previous 2 years, working through the afternoon's appointment log, with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided this was her domain and intended to manage it well. When the Range Rover pulled in, she noted the plate against the schedule, checked it off, and went back to what she was doing. At the end of the day, when the bay was quiet and Theo had gone home, Nyla found the framed invoice mounted on the wall beside the parts cabinet, the first invoice ever issued for Helena Whitmore's vehicle. She stood in front of it for a moment, reading the single line item. No wiring harness, no control modules, no armor recertification. Just one entry printed in plain type on a standard service form. Copper ground cable replacement, $15. Nyla turned around and asked her father why he hadn't charged more. The car was worth over $500,000. The repair had saved it. The math didn't seem right to her. Malcolm set down the diagnostic cable he was coiling and looked at the invoice for a moment before he answered. "Customers pay for the work you actually do," he said. "Not for the fear you could sell them." Nyla considered this, nodded once in the way she did when something made enough sense to file away, picked up her bag and went to get her things from the back room. Malcolm turned back to his workbench. The garage was the same as it had always been, 2 lifts of worn concrete floor tools arranged in a logic only he fully understood. The diagnostic machine, humming quietly in the corner, paid off now and fully his. Outside, the sign above the door caught the last of the evening light. It still hung at a slight angle from the missing mounting bolt. Malcolm had decided sometime in the past few weeks that he was going to leave it that way. A $15 part didn't save that vehicle. The knowledge of where to look, the discipline not to replace what wasn't broken, and the willingness to say so out loud, even when it cost him everything, that's what saved it. Malcolm didn't win because he was louder or better connected or more protected than the people who came after him. He won because every step he took could be measured, repeated, and verified by anyone willing to look at the data honestly. That's worth holding on to, whether you're in a garage, an office, or anywhere else. Someone hands you a number and expects you not to ask how they got there. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. There are more of them, and they all start the same way, with someone deciding that the truth is still worth the trouble.